The first time I saw the patrol car, I thought the county had finally started taking suburban crime seriously. Black sedan, white lettering on the doors, two uniformed men inside scanning the street as they owned it. Comment below and let me know where you are watching from, because what happened next in this quiet Texas neighborhood will make you question every uniform you have ever trusted. My name is Stephen Hall. I am 42 years old, a high school history teacher, and 3 months ago, my wife and I moved to Ridgewood Estates, looking for the kind of peace that comes with gated communities and manicured lawns. What we found instead was something that looked like safety, but felt like surveillance. By the second week, that patrol car had become a fixture, always circling, always watching, its presence less like protection and more like a slow tightening of something I could not name. Ridgewood Estates sat 20 minutes outside Dallas. 120 homes arranged along winding streets named after trees that no longer grew in Texas. The HOA fees were steep $450 a month, but the brochure promised premium security services and dedicated community protection. I assumed that meant cameras at the gate and maybe a night watchman. I did not assume it meant 2 men in tactical vests carrying sidearms, driving a vehicle designed to look exactly like an unmarked police cruiser. The first time one of them pulled over my neighbor for suspicious driving behavior within the community gates. I watched from my driveway and felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation you get when a picture hangs slightly crooked and you cannot stop staring at it. Elena noticed it before I did. She has always been better at reading situations' occupational habit, she calls it, though she never elaborates on what occupation requires that particular skill. We were sitting on the porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the roofline of the house across the street, when the patrol car rolled past. The driver, a thick-necked man in his late 50s, with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, slowed as he passed our driveway. He did not wave. He did not nod. He just looked. The way a predator looks at something it has not yet decided to chase. I turned to Elena and asked the question that had been building in my mind for weeks. They look like real cops, don't they? She did not answer immediately. Her eyes tracked the car as it passed, then narrowed slightly, focusing on something near the rear bumper. No, she said quietly. They don't. Real patrol units have municipal plates and a unit number on the trunk. That car has neither. I looked, but the car had already rounded the corner. Whatever she had seen, I had missed. I asked her how she knew that, but she just shook her head and went inside. Elena has always been careful with words. She measures them the way a carpenter measures lumber, cutting only what she needs and discarding the rest. I had learned over 15 years of marriage not to push when she went quiet. Whatever she had seen in that patrol car, she was not ready to share it. So I did what I always do when something does not make sense. I started paying attention. The next morning, I walked to the community mailbox at the end of our street and made a point of studying the patrol car parked near the clubhouse. Up close, the details told a different story than they did from a distance. The seal on the door was not a county seal or a state seal, it was custom designed, a shield with an eagle and the letters RSP beneath it. The words Ridgewood Security Police were stenciled in block letters, but the font was slightly uneven, as if printed by someone without access to official templates. No badge numbers on the vehicle, no unit designation, no municipal plates, just like Elena had said. The man behind the wheel watched me watching him. After a moment, he stepped out of the car and walked toward me with the kind of swagger that belongs in a Hollywood movie, not a suburban cul-de-sac. His uniform was black cargo pants, tactical boots, a vest with police embroidered across the chest. The badge pinned to his shirt gleamed in the morning light, but it had no number, no issuing authority, just that same eagle and shield logo. He stopped 3 feet away and planted his hands on his belt, thumbs hooked near the holstered pistol on his right hip. I became aware of my own heartbeat, a low, steady thrum that had accelerated without my permission. "Morning," he said. "You're the new resident on Willow Lane." "Hall, right." I confirmed my name and waited. He nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away for later. "I'm Chief Murdoch, Frank Murdoch, head of security for Ridgewood Estates. If you have any problems, any concerns, you can come to me. We keep this community safe. That's our job. That's our authority." He emphasized the last word in a way that felt less like reassurance and more like a warning. I thanked him and walked back to my house. But his words stayed with me. Authority. Not responsibility, not service. Authority. In 15 years of teaching American history, I had learned to recognize the difference between people who earn power and people who claim it. Frank Murdoch carried himself like a man who had claimed something he was never given. That night, I mentioned the encounter to Elena. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her fingers slowly turning her wedding ring, a habit she had when she was processing something important. When I finished, she asked a single question. "Did you see his credentials? Any state certification? Anything that connects him to an actual law enforcement agency?" I admitted I had not. She nodded once, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Then we need to start paying closer attention," she said, "because those men are not what they claim to be." She did not explain what she had seen. She did not need to. The look in her eyes said everything. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of time before something went very wrong. The next morning, I started digging. 15 years of teaching history had taught me that the most dangerous lies are the ones dressed in familiar uniforms, and Frank Murdoch's uniform was starting to look less familiar by the hour. I began with the basics, a simple search for Ridgewood Security Police and Blackwood County Law Enforcement. The results told me everything I needed to know. Ridgewood Security Police did not exist in any county database. It was not listed as a subsidiary of the sheriff's office. It had no accreditation with the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. According to every official record I could find, the organization that patrolled our streets with badges and guns was a private security company operating under a contract with the Homeowners Association. Private security, not law enforcement, and under Texas law. The difference between those two things is the difference between authority and theater. I spent the afternoon building a file. Texas Occupations Code, Chapter 17, O2 governs private security, and studying it felt like watching Murdoch's operation unravel section by section. Section 17, O2.323. No private security officer may wear a uniform or use a title that implies they are a peace officer. Section 17, O2.324. No security company may use the word police in its name. Section 17, O2.328. Armed officers must carry their license and display it upon request. Private security guards cannot conduct traffic stops on public streets. They cannot demand identification. They cannot detain anyone unless they witness a felony in progress. Everything I had seen Murdoch and his men do fell outside these boundaries. Either they did not know the law, or they were counting on us not knowing it either. That evening, I walked 2 houses down to meet Owen Hartley. Owen was 63 years old, retired from the Postal Service, and one of the first residents to move into Ridgewood Estates when it was built 8 years ago. He had been pulled over by Murdoch's men twice in the past year, once for failing to display a valid community parking permit, and once for sitting in his own driveway waiting for his wife to come outside. When I knocked on his door and explained that I was trying to understand how the security patrol operated, he invited me in without hesitation. The look on his face told me he had been waiting for someone to ask these questions for a long time. He led me to a worn armchair in his living room and settled in with the heaviness of a man carrying stories he had never been able to tell. Last spring, they issued me a citation for leaving my garbage cans out past noon on collection day, Owen said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. A citation, like a traffic ticket, $200 or appear at the clubhouse for a compliance hearing, I paid because I did not want the hassle, but my neighbor, Tom Reeves, refused, said they had no authority to fine him for anything. Owen paused, rubbing the back of his neck. They showed up at his door the next day, 2 of them, told him he was being summoned to the clubhouse to answer for his non-compliance. When Tom asked what would happen if he refused, Murdoch said, and I will never forget this, then we will have to handle it ourselves. Owen let the words hang in the air between us. Tom moved out 3 weeks later, did not even wait to sell the house, just packed up his family and left everything behind. I asked Owen if he knew anything about Murdoch's background, and he nodded slowly, as if debating whether to share something he had kept to himself for too long. He told me he had looked into Murdoch after what happened to Tom. Murdoch used to work loss prevention for a retail chain down in Houston store security, catching shoplifters, reviewing camera footage. That was the extent of his law enforcement experience. No certification, no peace officer license, nothing that gave him the authority to wear that badge or carry that gun the way he did. The HOA paid him $85,000 a year to run this operation, and Margaret Holloway, the board president, let him do whatever he wanted as long as property values stayed high, and nobody complained too loudly. I asked what happened to the people who did complain. Owen just shook his head and said quietly that they were not here anymore. I walked home in the dark, my mind turning over everything Owen had told me. A fake police force run by a man with no credentials, an HOA president who enabled it all, and residents were too afraid to push back because they had seen what happened to those who did. I thought about Elena, her observation about the missing plates, her question about state certification, her insistence that we needed to pay closer attention. She knew something. She had known from the beginning. When I got home, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, scrolling through what looked like legal documents. She looked up when I walked in, and for the first time since we moved here, I saw something in her eyes that was not concern. It was a calculation. I told her I had talked to Owen Hartley, that Murdoch had no law enforcement background, that he was running a private security company dressed up like a police department. Elena nodded, completely unsurprised. "I know," she said, "and it is worse than that." She turned the laptop toward me and pointed to a highlighted passage. She had pulled the HOA's security contract from the county records office that afternoon. Section 4, paragraph 12. I leaned in and read the words that would change everything. Security personnel are authorized to detain and question residents suspected of violating community guidelines pending resolution by the board. The words hit me like cold water. Detain and question, not observe and report, not request compliance. Detain. I thought about Tom Reeves being summoned to the clubhouse. I thought about what handling it ourselves might actually mean. My throat tightened. I said quietly that what I was looking at was not security. Elena's voice was flat, precise, carrying the weight of expertise I had never fully understood. Under the Texas Penal Code, she explained, restraining someone's movement without legal authority is unlawful restraint, a Class A misdemeanor. If they use a weapon or threat of force, it becomes a felony. She closed the laptop and met my eyes. Based on what I had just told her about Tom Reeves, she believed they had already crossed that line. The question was whether they would do it again and what would happen when someone finally refused to comply. The summons arrived 3 days later. I found it tucked under my windshield wiper. When I came out to get the morning paper, a single sheet of paper in a clear plastic sleeve, printed on letterhead that featured the same eagle and shield logo I had seen on Murdoch's badge. The header read, Ridgewood Security Police Official Notice, in bold capital letters. Below it, my name, my address, and a single paragraph that made my jaw tighten. You are hereby required to appear at the Ridgewood Estates Community Center on Saturday at 1000 hours to address concerns regarding your recent conduct and failure to cooperate with community security protocols. Failure to appear may result in further enforcement action. At the bottom, Frank Murdoch's signature sprawled across the page like he was signing a warrant. I stood in my driveway, holding that piece of paper, and felt something shift from concern to something colder. They were escalating, and they had just made their first mistake. I showed the summons to Elena before she left for work that morning. She studied it for a long moment, then handed it back and told me to go. Listen to what they say, ask questions, but give them nothing, no admissions, no apologies, no agreements, just observe. I asked her if she thought it was safe. She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, and something passed across her face that I had seen only a handful of times in 15 years of marriage, a stillness that preceded decisive action. They think they have authority over you, she said quietly. Let them keep thinking that, for now. Then she was gone, and I was left standing in the kitchen with a fake summons and a growing certainty that my wife was already several moves ahead in a game I was only beginning to understand. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, the kind of Texas weather that makes everything feel heavier than it should. The Ridgewood Estates Community Center was a low-slung building near the main gate. designed to look like a small-town courthouse, but functioning primarily as a venue for HOA meetings and holiday parties. When I walked through the front door at exactly 10 o'clock, I found Frank Murdoch waiting for me in a room that had been arranged to look like an interrogation chamber, a single table in the center, 2 chairs facing each other, harsh fluorescent lighting overhead that buzzed with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. Murdoch sat on one side with his hands folded on the table, wearing his full uniform tactical vest, badge, holstered weapon. Behind him stood another man in the same black uniform, younger, with the nervous energy of someone trying too hard to look intimidating. I recognized him from the patrol car Derek Sloan, according to the name tag on his chest. Neither of them stood when I entered. Neither of them offered a handshake. Murdoch gestured to the empty chair across from him and told me to have a seat. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. I sat down and waited. He opened a manila folder on the table and began flipping through pages as if reviewing a case file. "Mr. Hall," he said without looking up, "you have been a resident of Ridgewood Estates for approximately 3 months. In that time, you have been observed conducting what appears to be surveillance of security personnel, asking questions about our operations, and encouraging other residents to challenge community protocols." He looked up, his eyes cold. That kind of behavior creates problems that we are authorized to address. I asked him what kind of authorization he was referring to. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "The HOA has granted this department full authority to maintain order and ensure compliance with community guidelines. That authority includes the power to investigate, to issue citations, and to detain individuals who pose a threat to community safety." He leaned forward slightly. "You are starting to look like a threat, Mr. Hall." I kept my voice level and told him that no HOA contract could grant authority that violated state law. I told him that impersonating law enforcement was a felony in Texas, and that everything I had seen suggested his organization was operating well outside legal boundaries. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, and in that half-second of shifting shadow, I saw something pass across Murdoch's face, not fear, but the careful recalculation of a man who had expected capitulation and received resistance instead. He leaned back in his chair and exchanged a glance with Sloan. "You have been doing your homework," he said slowly. "That is interesting. Most residents do not bother." He closed the folder and placed his hands flat on the table. "Let me be clear about something. Mr. Hall, this community has rules, and we have the authority to enforce them. You can quote the state code all you want, but inside these gates, our word is what matters. People who make themselves problems tend to find that living here becomes very uncomfortable very quickly." I asked him if he was claiming that HOA contracts superseded state law. He smiled a thin, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. "I am claiming that what happens inside this community stays inside this community, and people who forget that well." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. I understand your wife works in some kind of government position, county level, is that right?" The question landed like a stone in still water. He had done his research, or someone had done it for him. "It would be unfortunate," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "If her home life started creating complications for her professional reputation, small communities talk, rumors spread, I am sure you understand." The threat was wrapped in pleasantries, but its edges were razor sharp. I felt my hands tighten on the armrests of the chair, knuckles whitening, but I kept my expression neutral. I stood and told him I appreciated his time. I told him I would certainly discuss the matter with my wife. His smile widened slightly, mistaking my composure for compliance. I was almost at the door when he delivered his final line. "One more thing, Mr. Hall. We have a holding area for residents who refuse to comply with community standards. So far, we have not had to use it for extended periods." He paused, letting the words settle. "I would hate for that to change." I stopped walking. A holding area. The phrase connected to fragments I had filed away without understanding Owen mentioning that Tom Reeves had been summoned to the clubhouse. The rumors I had heard at the mailbox about residents who disappeared for a few hours before emerging quieter and more compliant. I had assumed those were exaggerations, the kind of suburban mythology that grows in gated communities. Now I understand they were not mythology at all. They were running a detention operation inside a housing development, and they had just told me about it like it were a selling point. When I got home, Elena was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp with anticipation. She did not ask how it went. She could see it on my face. I told her about the meeting, about Murdoch's claims, about the veiled threat he had made regarding her reputation. I told her about the holding area. She listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup, steam rising between us in the humid air. When I finished, she set the cup down slowly. "He mentioned my job." I nodded. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not anger, but something more dangerous: resolution. "Then he just crossed a line he does not know exists." She stood and walked inside without elaborating. I followed, knowing that whatever came next would be far more serious than a fake summons and a bullying interrogation. Murdoch had made it personal, and my wife was not the kind of woman who let that go unanswered. The next 72 hours became an exercise in systematic documentation. Elena took the lead, and I learned more about my wife in those 3 days than I had in the previous 3 years. She started with the vehicles. On Monday evening, she drove past the clubhouse at exactly the time the patrol cars were parked for shift change and photographed their license plates from the street. That night, she ran the plates through a database that required credentials I had never seen her use before. When I asked how she had access, she said only that her work occasionally required verifying vehicle registrations for county purposes, and left it at that. The results were damning. None of the 3 vehicles was registered with Blackwood County or any state law enforcement registry. 2 were registered to a shell company called RSP Holdings, LLC. The 3rd was registered to Frank Murdoch personally, listed as a private vehicle with no commercial or security designation. Tuesday, she focused on the uniforms. She pulled up photographs I had taken of Murdoch and Sloan and enlarged them on her laptop screen. The badges were the clearest new violation we had not yet documented. In Texas, private security officers must wear identification that explicitly labels them as security rather than police different colors, different shapes, clear distinctions. Murdoch's badges were designed to look identical to county sheriff badges, silver 5-pointed stars with an eagle at the center. Manufacturing and wearing badges designed to impersonate law enforcement was a 3rd-degree felony under Texas Penal Code, Section 37.11, separate from and additional to the impersonation charges we had already identified. Every day Murdoch put on that uniform, he was committing a crime that could put him in prison for up to 10 years. Wednesday brought the most disturbing discovery. Elena obtained a copy of the community center's floor plan from the county building permits office. She spread the blueprints across our kitchen table and pointed to a room at the back of the building that was not listed on the public facility map available to residents. According to the original permits, it was designated as storage. According to modifications filed 18 months ago, it had been converted into what the paperwork called a secure compliance processing room, a room with a reinforced door, no windows, and a lock that could only be opened from the outside. I asked Elena why we could not simply take everything we had gathered to the real county sheriff and let them handle it. She shook her head. Murdoch had connections. She explained. Margaret Holloway sat on the county planning commission. The inspector who had approved the holding room modifications was her brother-in-law. Filing a complaint through normal channels would trigger a warning that reached Murdoch before any investigation could begin. We needed an incident, something undeniable, something public before we could be certain the right people would act on what we had found. That evening, we sat on the back porch organizing everything into a single folder: photographs, registration records, badge analysis, building permits, and a timeline of incidents compiled from Owen's testimony and my own observations. I asked Elena what would happen if Murdoch never crossed the line clearly enough to expose himself. She was quiet for a moment, then told me that men like Murdoch always overreach. Power without accountability was an addiction, and addicts always needed a bigger dose. When he made his move, we would be ready. I wanted to believe her, but waiting for someone to get hurt felt like complicity. She seemed to read my thoughts and put her hand on mine. "We are not waiting for him to hurt someone," she said. We are positioning ourselves to stop him when he tries. I spent that night unable to sleep, thinking about the residents who had lived under Murdoch's authority for years, Owen with his quiet resignation, Tom Reeves who had fled rather than fight, the neighbors who looked away when the patrol car passed. They had accepted it because challenging it seemed impossible. But Elena had shown me something different. She had shown me that authority without legal foundation was just performance, and performances could be exposed. The question was, what would happen when we finally pulled back the curtain? I did not have to wait long for an answer. The next morning, Owen Hartley's wife called in tears. Owen had been taken. 2 of Murdoch's men had arrived at his door an hour earlier, told him he was being detained for failure to comply with community guidelines, and escorted him to the clubhouse. He had not been seen since. I asked her if she knew why they had come for Owen specifically. She said that one of the guards had mentioned Owen was seen talking to me outside his house 3 days ago. They had been watching, probably from the patrol car that circled the block every 40 minutes like clockwork. My visit had marked him. My questions had made him a target. The guilt hit me like a physical weight, but there was no time to process it. Elena had already grabbed her keys and was heading for the door. I asked her where she was going. She stopped, turned, and looked at me with eyes that had turned to steel. "He just made his move," she said quietly. "Now we make ours. And this time, he is not threatening someone who cannot fight back." We arrived at the clubhouse 17 minutes after Owen's wife called. The parking lot was empty except for the 3 black patrol cars lined up near the entrance like a barricade. Elena pulled our car to the far edge of the lot and cut the engine. I started to open my door, but she put a hand on my arm. "Wait," she said. Through the tinted windows of the community center, I could see shapes moving, at least 2 figures in black uniforms. Derek Sloan stood at the front entrance with his arms crossed, positioned like a sentry, and somewhere inside that building, in a room with no windows, Owen Hartley was being held against his will for the crime of talking to his neighbor. Elena reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small digital camera I had never seen before. She pointed it at the building and began taking photographs, the vehicles, the license plates, Sloan's position, the timestamp on the dashboard, documentation, she said. Evidence that could not be disputed later. She asked me to repeat exactly what Owen's wife had said on the phone. I told her 2 men at the door, a statement about failure to comply with community guidelines. Owen was escorted away without resistance. Elena nodded. Then she told me to go home and wait. I started to protest, but she cut me off. If we both walked in there right now, Murdoch would get defensive, maybe move Owen somewhere we could not find him. She needed me to go home and call Owen's wife, tell her to document everything, gather any witnesses, but not to contact outside authorities yet. I asked her what she was going to do. She told me she would stay and observe a watch who came and went, how long they kept Owen, whether they followed any kind of procedure or just made it up as they went. Pattern documentation, she called it. Building a case required knowing exactly how the system operated when it thought no one was watching. I drove home alone, my hands tight on the steering wheel. When I got there, I found 3 neighbors standing on the sidewalk in front of Owen's house, speaking in low voices. Janet Pruitt, a retired accountant who had lived in Ridgewood for 6 years, waved me over. She asked if I knew what had happened. I told her Owen had been taken to the clubhouse. She nodded grimly, unsurprised, and told me this was the 3rd time something like this had occurred. The first was Carlos Mendez, who had complained about security fees at an HOA meeting. He was detained for 4 hours and emerged pale and silent. He moved out the following month without ever speaking about what happened. His wife later told Janet he had been threatened with legal action if he discussed the incident publicly. The second was Patricia Vance, held for 6 hours before her husband threatened to call the state police. When he actually tried, he discovered that Murdoch had connections in the county. Margaret Holloway's brother-in-law worked in the sheriff's administrative office. The complaint was dismissed as an internal HOA matter before it ever reached an investigator. I asked Janet why no one had gone to the media or contacted a lawyer. She looked at me with tired eyes. "Most people who live here are not wealthy," she said. "They cannot afford lawyers. And the local news does not care about HOA disputes in gated communities. It is not the kind of story that gets attention. Murdoch knows this. He picked this community because the residents have enough to lose but not enough resources to fight back." She shook her head. He built a perfect little kingdom where the only law is whatever he decides it is. I thought about Elena's words from the night before power without accountability was an addiction. Murdoch had been feeding that addiction for years, and no one had been able to stop him. Elena returned home 2 hours later. Her posture had changed. There was a tension in her shoulders, a focused energy that I had not seen before. She asked me what I had learned from the neighbors. I told her about Carlos Mendez and Patricia Vance. I told her about the connections that had killed the complaint. She listened without interrupting, her expression hardening with each detail. When I finished, she walked to the window and stood looking out at the street, at the patrol car that rolled past on its regular circuit. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying an edge that made something cold settle in my stomach. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I am going to drive through that front gate like any other resident. I am not going to show identification. I am not going to answer questions. I am going to see exactly how far Frank Murdoch is willing to go when someone refuses to comply." The words hit me before I fully processed them. My wife was going to deliberately provoke a confrontation with armed men who had already demonstrated they were willing to detain people illegally. I felt my throat tighten. I asked her if that was safe. She turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I had never seen in 15 years of marriage. Not fear, not anger, but absolute certainty. Murdoch has spent years building this operation because he believes no one with real authority will ever challenge him, she said. Tomorrow, he finds out how wrong he is. She paused, and I saw something in her eyes that made me realize I was looking at a part of my wife that had always existed but had never needed to emerge. And when he does, I want every resident in this community watching. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her there had to be another way. But the look on her face told me the decision had already been made. Whatever was going to happen tomorrow, Elena had been preparing for it longer than I understood. And Frank Murdoch had no idea what was coming. The morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of Texas autumn day that makes everything feel sharper than it should. Elena dressed in plainclothes jeans, a white blouse, nothing that would suggest anything other than an ordinary resident running an ordinary errand. I watched her check her reflection in the hallway mirror, then reach into the closet and retrieve something from a lockbox I had never seen her open. A leather credential case, worn at the edges from years of use. She slipped it into her back pocket and caught me watching. 20 years, she said quietly. I have carried this every single day for 20 years. Today is the first time I will use it to protect my own home. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Everything she had done since we moved here, the databases, the building permits, the systematic documentation suddenly made perfect sense. She told me to follow in my car 5 minutes after she left, park near the community mailboxes, and film everything on my phone, and she told me not to intervene, no matter what happened. I followed her instructions. By the time I reached the mailboxes, a small crowd had already gathered. Janet Pruitt, several neighbors from Owen Street, and residents I had never spoken to. Word had spread overnight. People knew something was coming. Elena's silver sedan was approaching the gate. The black patrol car was already there, positioned to block entry. Frank Murdoch stood beside it with Derek Sloan, both in full uniform, both armed. I raised my phone and started recording. Elena pulled up to the gate and stopped. Murdoch approached her window with that familiar swagger, the walk of a man who believed he owned everything within sight. He gestured for her to roll down the window. She did. He said something I could not hear. Elena shook her head. The exchange continued for 30 seconds. Then Murdoch's posture changed. His shoulders squared. His hand moved to his hip. He drew his pistol and pointed it directly at my wife's face through the open car window. Someone in the crowd gasped. Janet Pruitt grabbed my arm. I kept the camera steady, forcing myself to breathe. Through the windshield, I could see Elena's profile, not frozen, not panicked, but waiting, like someone who had faced weapons before and knew exactly when to move. Murdoch was shouting now. "Step out of the vehicle. Do it now. I will not ask again." Elena opened her car door slowly and stepped out. She kept her hands at her sides, visible but not raised. She was facing Murdoch now, less than 6 feet away, with a loaded pistol pointed at her chest. The crowd had grown to perhaps 15 people, all of them watching from behind parked cars and mailboxes. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Elena's voice cut through the morning air. It was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity. "Frank Murdoch, you are pointing a weapon at a law enforcement officer. I am giving you exactly 3 seconds to lower that firearm before I place you under arrest." Murdoch's face twisted not with fear, but with incredulity. He laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "Law enforcement, lady. I do not know what game you think you are playing, but inside these gates, I am the law enforcement." He gestured with his free hand at the patrol cars, the uniforms, the badges. "You see all this? This is authority, real authority, and you are about to learn what happens to people who do not respect it." Elena did not respond. She reached slowly toward her back pocket. Murdoch's finger tightened on the trigger. "Do not move," he snapped. She ignored him. She withdrew the leather credential case and flipped it open, holding it up so that everyone present could see what was inside. A badge. Gold, 5-pointed star, with an official state seal and an engraved number beneath it. "I am Sheriff Elena Hall," she said. "Blackwood County Sheriff's Department. You are under arrest for felony impersonation of a law enforcement officer, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and unlawful restraint." The words landed like physical blows. Murdoch's expression cycled through confusion, then denial, then something that looked like desperation. "That is not real," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "You cannot just this is private property. You have no jurisdiction here. The HOA contract gives us—" Elena cut him off. "I am the chief law enforcement officer of this county. My jurisdiction extends to every square inch of Blackwood County, including this parking lot, including that clubhouse, and including the room where you are currently holding Owen Hartley against his will." She took one step toward him. "Your HOA contract is not a constitution. It does not supersede Texas state law, and it certainly does not give you the right to point a weapon at a peace officer." Murdoch stood frozen, the gun still raised but wavering now. I could see him searching for an escape, some argument that would restore his authority. "I have connections," he said, his voice cracking. "Margaret Holloway, she sits on the county planning commission. You cannot just—" Elena's expression did not change. "Margaret Holloway is being investigated for conspiracy to commit fraud. Her brother-in-law has already been suspended pending review. Your connections are gone. Mr. Murdoch, you are alone." The gun lowered an inch, then another. Murdoch's face had gone gray, the color of a man watching everything he had built crumble in real time. For a moment, I thought he might try something desperate, raise the weapon again, make a run for the patrol car. Then his shoulders collapsed. The gun dropped to his side, his knees buckled, and he sank to the asphalt. Behind him, Derek Sloan was already backing away with his hands raised, wanting no part of whatever came next. Elena stepped forward and kicked Murdoch's weapon out of reach. She ordered Sloan to his knees beside his boss. Both men complied without resistance. I lowered my phone and looked around at the crowd. Janet with tears streaming down her face, neighbors clutching each other, faces filled with something I had not seen in this community since we arrived. Relief. Elena pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice crisp and professional. "This is Sheriff Hall. I need units at the Ridgewood Estates main gate immediately. 2 suspects are in custody. And send someone to the community center. We have a resident being held in an unlawful detention facility." She ended the call and looked at the crowd for the first time. "Owen Hartley will be released within the hour. Anyone who has been victimized by these men should contact my office. We are going to make this right." The sirens started in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The first county cruiser arrived 4 minutes after Elena's call, then a second, then a third, within 15 minutes. The main gate of Ridgewood Estates looked like the scene of a major crime, which I supposed it was. Deputy Carlos Reyes was the first to approach Elena, and watching them interact felt like seeing a stranger wear my wife's face. He addressed her as sheriff, took her preliminary report, and immediately dispatched 2 officers to the community center to locate the holding facility and release Owen Hartley. I had been married to this woman for 15 years. I had watched her make coffee, grade my students' papers when I was overwhelmed, and fall asleep on the couch during old movies, and I had never known. The realization sat heavy in my chest, not anger exactly, but something more complicated. A door had opened into a room I did not know existed. Murdoch and Sloan were handcuffed and placed in separate patrol cars. Murdoch had not spoken since his collapse. He sat in the back seat with his head bowed, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Sloan was more animated, insisting loudly that he had only been following orders, that Murdoch had told him they had legal authority. Deputy Reyes read them both their rights and informed them of the charges: felony impersonation of a law enforcement officer under Texas Penal Code, Section 37.11, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon under Section 22.02, and unlawful restraint under Section 20.02. Additional charges were pending. Murdoch would be facing a minimum of 15 years if convicted on all counts. Sloan, depending on his cooperation, could be looking at 5 to 10, 20 minutes after the arrests. Owen Hartley emerged from the community center flanked by two deputies. He looked pale and shaken, but he was walking under his own power. His wife ran to meet him, and I watched them embrace in the parking lot while neighbors gathered around. Owen caught my eye over his wife's shoulder and nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. He had been held for nearly 18 hours, questioned repeatedly about his disloyalty to the community. I felt the guilt rise, but Owen shook his head before I could apologize. "You did not put me in that room," he said quietly. "They did, and now they are going to answer for it." The investigation expanded rapidly over the next several hours. Deputies secured the holding facility and began documenting everything: the reinforced door, the lock mechanism, the bare concrete walls, the single chair bolted to the floor. A preliminary search of Murdoch's office turned up a logbook listing residents who had been detained over the past 3 years. 14 names in the initial review, though investigators believed there could be more once they examined digital records. The logbook also contained financial records showing that Murdoch had been receiving bonuses from the HOA for each successful resolution. With Murdoch in handcuffs and county officers visibly in control, residents who had stayed silent for years began approaching deputies to give statements. Janet Pruitt was among the first, followed by 3 neighbors I had never spoken to. The fear that had kept this community paralyzed was finally breaking. Margaret Holloway arrived around noon, summoned for questioning. She stepped out of her Mercedes expecting to manage a minor inconvenience, and found herself facing a parking lot full of patrol cars. Elena met her at the edge of the crime scene tape. I watched Margaret's expression shift, the initial irritation giving way to confusion as she processed the scope of what was happening. Then a visible tightening around her eyes when Elena began speaking. She was not arrested that day, but she was informed that she was a person of interest in an ongoing investigation into fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to unlawful restraint. Her brother-in-law, the county inspector who had approved the holding facility, had already been suspended. She said nothing when Elena finished. She simply turned and walked back to her car, her steps slower than when she had arrived. By late afternoon, the immediate crisis had been contained. Murdoch and Sloan were in the county lockup, awaiting arraignment. The holding facility had been sealed as a crime scene. Elena had been everywhere directing traffic, reviewing evidence, speaking with witnesses, but now she finally walked over to where I was standing by our car. She looked exhausted in a way I had rarely seen. I wanted to tell her I understood why she had kept her identity hidden. I wanted to say I was proud of her, but what came out instead was something raw. I asked her if it had been hard. Lying to me for 3 months? She did not flinch. She said it was not lying, it was compartmentalization. She had learned early in her career that the only way to investigate corruption was to see it the way victims saw it. If she had revealed herself on day 1, Murdoch would have hidden everything. The only way to end this was to let him believe he was untouchable. I understood the logic, I even admired it, but I could not shake the feeling that I had been living with someone I did not fully know. Elena seemed to read my thoughts. She took my hand and said that she was still the same person who burned toast every Sunday morning and cried at animal rescue videos. The badge did not change that. It just meant she had tools most people did not have, and a responsibility to use them when it mattered. I looked back at the community center, where deputies were still processing the scene. Owen was sitting on a bench with his wife, surrounded by neighbors who had finally stopped being afraid to stand together. "This is not over," Elena said quietly. "The trial will take months. Margaret Holloway will fight every charge. Some of these residents will have to testify." She paused. But for the first time in years, The people who live here can walk outside without wondering if today is the day they become a target. That is worth something. I squeezed her hand. She was right. It was worth everything. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks later in the Blackwood County Courthouse. I sat in the gallery with Owen Hartley and Janet Pruitt, watching Frank Murdoch stand before Judge Patricia Okonkwo in an orange jumpsuit. He kept his eyes fixed on the defense table, refusing to look at the gallery, where residents he had terrorized for years now sat as witnesses against him. His attorney requested bail, citing ties to the community and a lack of prior criminal record. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Reeves, stood and delivered a single, devastating summary. Her client had operated an unlawful detention facility, impersonated law enforcement for 3 years, and pointed a loaded weapon at a peace officer. The investigation had already identified 14 victims, with more expected as digital records were reviewed. She recommended remand without bail. Judge Okonkwo agreed. Derek Sloan's hearing followed immediately after. He had cooperated with investigators, providing detailed testimony about how the operation had functioned. His statement implicated not only Murdoch, but also Margaret Holloway, who he claimed had personally approved the methods used against detained residents. Sloan received 3 years with the possibility of parole after 18 months lighter than he deserved, but his testimony would be crucial in the cases that followed. Margaret Holloway was arraigned 2 days later on charges of conspiracy and accessory. She posted bail immediately, but the damage was done. The woman who had controlled this community through connections and quiet threats was now a defendant whose name appeared in every local news headline. The HOA held an emergency meeting the following Saturday. When Elena and I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was full, and residents lined the walls because there were not enough chairs. The atmosphere was different from any gathering I had attended here, not the tense silence I had grown accustomed to, but something restless and unfinished, like a room full of people who had not yet decided what they wanted to become. The agenda had a single item, a vote of no confidence in the current board. The motion passed 87-4. A temporary committee was formed to draft new bylaws, and Owen Hartley was elected to lead it. When he stood to accept, he gripped the podium with both hands and spoke without notes. He said he had spent 8 years in this community keeping his head down. He said that was over. He said they would build something better, not perfect, but accountable. The applause that followed was not triumphant. It was determined. The weeks that followed were messier than I had expected. Some residents threw themselves into the reform process, attending every meeting and volunteering for committees. Others hung back, waiting to see whether the changes would last or whether some new authority would fill the vacuum. A handful of longtime Holloway supporters listed their homes for sale, unwilling to remain in a community that had turned against the leadership they had enabled. I did not blame them. Exactly. Admitting complicity is harder than admitting victimhood. The people who left were not villains. They were simply unwilling to sit with the discomfort of what their silence had allowed. Elena returned to work full-time, and our life settled into something resembling normalcy. But I found myself circling back to the same question in quiet moments, how she had lived beside me for 15 years, carrying a secret that large. Part of me understood her reasoning. Part of me felt like a stranger in my own marriage. One morning, while she was making coffee, I finally said it out loud. I told her I was still processing. I told her that understanding why she did it was not the same as being at peace with it. She set down the coffee pot and turned to face me. She did not apologize. She said she had made a choice years ago to keep her work separate from our home, and that choice had costs she was still learning to measure. She said she would understand if I needed time. I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the sheriff, not the strategist, but the woman who had cried at our wedding and stayed up all night when my father was in the hospital. The badge was part of her. It was not all of her. I told her I did not need time. I needed her to stop making coffee so badly. She laughed. And something that had been tight in my chest finally loosened. A month after the arrests, the community held its first neighborhood gathering since the reforms began. Not an HOA meeting, just a potluck in the park near the main gate, organized by Janet Pruitt and a group of residents who had never spoken to each other before all of this started. Elena and I brought a casserole that she had burned slightly on one side. Owen Hartley was there with his wife, talking to neighbors who had once been afraid to make eye contact with him. Children ran across the grass while their parents stood in loose circles. Conversations awkward but genuine. The patrol cars were gone. The fake uniforms were evidence in a storage locker. The holding facility had been gutted. Its reinforced door removed and donated to a local theater company for set construction. Owen's idea, a way of turning something ugly into something absurd. I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching my wife hand a plate of burned casserole to Janet Pruitt, and felt something I had not expected to feel when we first moved here. Not safety exactly. Safety was what Murdoch had promised, and his version of it had been a cage. This was different. This was belonging imperfect, uncertain, and earned. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. I walked over to join my wife, and for the first time since we arrived at Ridgewood Estates, I did not feel like a stranger in my own neighborhood.